Next to Shakespeare, Charles Dickens is the most recognized writer's name in the Western world. His well-known lines, "It was the best of times, it was the worst of times," and "God bless us, every one," are quoted more than any other author's lines. It was he who changed the traditional Happy Christmas greeting to Merry Christmas. Dickens published 15 major novels, but is best remembered for A Christmas Carol, which he wrote in just 6 weeks. A critical commentary on Victorian England, many of the characters were modeled from his own family. His father was sentenced to debtor's prison, and Tiny Tim was his frail nephew who died of tuberculosis. Oh, but he saved the best when he molded Ebenezer Scrooge after Ebenezer Scroggy, a lecherous town councilman who pinched ladies' bottoms as they walked by. Incredibly, Dickens couldn't find a publisher willing to accept his book, so in 1843, not willing to accept defeat, Dickens self-published A Christmas Carol. Young Charles often spent his evenings walking for miles through the streets of Victorian London to find inspirational subjects to write about. His first book, entitled Sketches by Boz, after his little brother's nickname, was a flop. Dickens acknowledged the failure, wryly commenting that it fell stillborn from the press. Some time later, that publisher was trying to find a writer to provide captions for a sketchbook. Glimpsing across a dusty bookshelf, he spotted Sketches by Boz, thus prompting a search with a whimsical theme, "Who the Dickens is Boz?" They finally found the 23-year-old, and he had some very innovative suggestions. Instead of costly wood book covers and spines, use cardboard. Replace high-quality paper with cheaper pulp. And instead of publishing the whole work in one volume, offer monthly sequels, leaving the reader twisting in the wind so that he would have to come back to find out what happened to the endangered hero. Thus was born the Pickwick Papers. In one fell swoop, Charles Dickens had invented the paperback, pulp fiction, the serial, and the cliffhanger. But that wasn't all. When the faithful readers returned for their last installment, there in front of them was a luxury-bound edition of the entire work. By now, their 19 monthly editions were merely a pile of paper. They just had to have this consummate volume on their bookshelf. But wait, there's more. Dickens assembled a team to go door to door, offering to buy back from his readers the original series, at a reduced price, of course. Dickens reassembled those original pages into gilt-lined, covered albums and titled them The Collector's Edition, printed on original paper when this famous work was first published. Yes, the folks had to have that, too. Such was the remarkable career of Charles Dickens, a 19th century hack writer who became a publishing titan, earning millions of dollars as the only author in history to sell the same novel 3 times to the same readers. Really out of the wick standing up there. Oh, there we go. There we go. Marley was dead. There was no doubt whatever about that. The register of his burial was signed by the clergyman, the clerk, the undertaker, and the chief mourner. Scrooge signed it. And Scrooge's name was good for anything he chose to put his hand to. Old Marley was dead as a doornail. I don't know what there is particularly dead about a doornail, but Marley was dead as a doornail. Scrooge and he were partners for many years. Scrooge never painted out old Marley's name. There it stood years afterwards above the warehouse door, Scrooge and Marley. Oh, but Scrooge is a tight-fisted, squeezing, grasping, clutching old sinner. The cold within his features froze those features, nipped his pointed nose, shriveled his cheeks, made his eyes red, his thin lips blue, and spoke out shrewdly in his shrill voice. He carried his own low temperature with him, and he didn't thaw 1 degree at Christmas. Nobody ever stopped him in the street to say, "My dear Scrooge, how are you?" Even blind men's dogs, when they saw him coming, would tug at their owners in doorways. But what did Scrooge care? It was the very thing he liked, warning all human sympathy to keep its distance. Once upon a time, upon a Christmas Eve, old Scrooge was sitting busy in his counting house. It was cold, bleak, biting, foggy weather. His clerk in a dismal little cell was copying letters. Scrooge had a very small fire, but the clerk's fire was so very much small that it looked more like one coal. But Scrooge kept the coal box in his own room, and so the clerk put on his white comforter and tried to warm himself on a candle. "A Merry Christmas, Uncle. God save you," cried the cheerful voice of Scrooge's nephew. It was the first notice Scrooge had of his approach. "Bah," said Scrooge. "Humbug." "Christmas a humbug, Uncle? You don't mean that, I'm sure." "I do. Out with Merry Christmas. What's Christmas time to you but a time for paying bills without money? A time for finding yourself a year older and not an hour richer? If I had my way, every idiot who goes about with Merry Christmas on his lips should be boiled with his own pudding and buried with a stake of holly through his heart." "Uncle, nephew, keep Christmas in your own way and let me keep it in mine." "Keep it? But you don't keep it." "Let me leave it alone then. Much good has ever done you." "There are many things from which I've derived good, but without profit," said the nephew. "I've always thought of Christmas time as a good time, a kind, forgiving, charitable, pleasant time. The only time in the long calendar year when men and women seem to open their hearts freely and think of all people as fellow travelers. And therefore, Uncle, though it has never put a scrap of gold or silver in my pocket, I believe it has done me good, and I say, God bless it." The clerk in the little room applauded. "Let me hear another sound from you," said Scrooge, "and now you'll keep Christmas by losing your situation." "Don't be angry, Uncle. Come and dine with us tomorrow." "Good afternoon." "I'm sorry with all my heart to find you so resolute, so a Merry Christmas, Uncle." "Good afternoon." "And a Happy New Year." "Good afternoon." The clerk, in letting Scrooge's nephew out, had let 2 other people in. They were pleasant, now stood with their hats off in Scrooge's office. They bowed to him. "Scrooge and Marley's, I believe," said one of the gentlemen, referring to his list. "Have I the pleasure of addressing Mr. Scrooge or Mr. Marley?" "Mr. Marley died 7 years ago, this night." "At this festive season of the year, Mr. Scrooge," said the gentleman, taking up a pen, "we make provision for the poor and destitute. Hundreds of thousands are in want of common comforts." "Are there no prisons?" "Plenty of prisons, but scarcely furnished Christian cheer of mind. So a few of us are endeavoring to raise a fund to buy the poor some meat and drink and means of warmth. What shall I put you down for?" "Nothing." "Oh, you wish to be anonymous?" "I wish to be left alone. I don't make merry myself at Christmas, and I can't afford to make idle people merry. I hope to support the prisons and the workhouses, and those who are badly off must go there." "Many can't go there, and many would rather die." "If they would rather die, they'd better do it and decrease the surplus population." Seeing that it would be useless to pursue their point, the gentlemen withdrew. At length, the hour of shutting the counting house arrived. Scrooge dismounted from his stool, and the clerk snuffed out his candle and put on his hat. You'll want all day tomorrow, I suppose? If quite convenient, sir. It's not convenient, and it's not fair. If I was to stop paying you for it, you'd think yourself mighty ill-used, wouldn't you? Yes, sir. And yet you don't think me ill-used when I have to pay a day's wages for no work. It's only once a year, sir. A poor excuse for picking a man's pocket every 25th of December. But if you must have the whole day, be here all the earlier the next morning. The clerk promised that he would, and Scrooge walked out with a growl. Scrooge took his melancholy dinner in his usual melancholy tavern, read all the newspapers, and went home. He lived in chambers which had once belonged to his deceased partner, a gloomy suite of rooms, and nobody lived in it but Scrooge. There was nothing particular about the knocker on the door of this house. Scrooge had seen it night and morning during the whole residence in that place, and yet Scrooge, having his key in the lock of the door, saw not a knocker but Marley's face. Scrooge said, "Pooh, pooh," and closed the door with a bang. The sound resounded throughout the house like thunder. Scrooge fastened the door and walked up the stairs slowly, trimming his candle as he went. Darkness is cheap, and Scrooge liked it. But before he shut his heavy door, he walked through his rooms to see that all was right. He had just enough recollection of the face to desire to do that. Nobody under the table, nobody under the sofa, nobody in the closet, nobody in his dressing gown, which was hanging up in a suspicious attitude against the wall. Quite satisfied, he closed his door and double-locked himself in, which was not his custom. Thus secured against surprise, he took off his cravat, put on his dressing gown, slippers, and nightcap, and sat down before a very low fire. As he threw his head back in the chair, his glance happened to rest upon a disused bell that hung in the room for some purpose now forgotten. As he looked, he saw this bell begin to swing. Soon it rang out loudly. So did every bell in the house. The bells ceased, but were succeeded by a clanking noise deep down below, as if some person were dragging a heavy chain in the wine cellar. Scrooge remembered to have heard that ghosts in haunted houses were described as dragging chains. He heard the noise much louder on the floors below, then coming up the stairs, then coming straight toward his door. "It's humbug. I won't believe it." His color changed, though, when it came through the heavy door and passed into the room before his eyes. I know him. It's Marley's ghost." Marley in his pigtail waistcoat, tights, boots. The chain was wrapped about his middle and made of cash boxes, keys, padlocks, ledgers. His body was transparent so that Scrooge could see the two buttons on his coat behind. Scrooge had often heard it said that Marley had no guts, but he had never believed it until now. Said Scrooge, caustic and cold as ever, "What do you want with me?" "Much." "Who are you?" "Ask me who I was." "Who were you then?" "In life, I was your partner, Jacob Marley." "You don't believe in me?" "I don't." "Why do you doubt your senses?" "Because little things affect them, a slight disorder of the stomach. You may be an undigested bit of beef, a blot of mustard, a fragment of underdone potato. There's more gravy than grave about you, whatever you are." Scrooge was not in the habit of cracking jokes. He was trying to keep down his terror. The spirit raised a frightful cry and shook his chain with such a noise that Scrooge held on tight to his chair to save himself from fainting. Much greater was his horror when the phantom,
Taking off the bandage around his head, his lower jaw dropped down upon his breast. "Mercy, dreadful apparition, why do you trouble me? Man of the worldly mind, do you believe in me or not?" I do, I must. Why do spirits walk the earth, and why do they come to me? "It is required of every man that the spirit within him should walk among his fellow men. And if not in life, it is condemned to do so after death. I wear the chain I forged in life. I made it link by link. Would you know the weight and length of the coil you bear yourself?" Scrooge glanced at the floor, expecting to find himself surrounded by some 50 or 60 fathoms of iron cable, but he could see nothing. The ghost continued, "I cannot rest. I cannot linger anywhere. 7 years dead and traveling all the time. You travel fast on the wings of the wind." "But you were always a good man of business, Jacob," faltered Scrooge. "Business," cried the ghost, wringing his hands again. "Mankind was my business. Charity, mercy, benevolence were all my business. The dealings of my trade were but a drop of water in the ocean of my business. I'm here tonight to warn you that you have yet a chance of escaping my fate. You will be haunted by 3 spirits. I think I'd rather not. Expect the first when the bell tolls 1. For your own sake, remember what has passed between us." The apparition walked backward from him and floated out upon the bleak, dark night. Scrooge examined the door by which the ghost had entered. It was double locked, as he had locked it with his own hands, and the bolts were undisturbed. Scrooge tried to say humbug, but stopped at the first syllable. The emotion he had undergone in the lateness of the hour, he went straight to bed, fell asleep instantly. Scrooge awoke as the church clock tolled a deep, dull 1. Light flashed in the room, and the curtains of the bed were drawn aside by a strange figure, like an old man diminished to child's proportions. Its hair, which hung about its neck and down its back, was white with age. "Are you the spirit which was coming and foretold to me?" "I am the ghost of Christmas past." "Long past?" "No, you are past. The things that you will see with me are the shadows of the things that have been. Rise and walk with me." It would have been in vain for Scrooge to plead that the weather and the hour were not adapted to pedestrian purposes, that he was clad but lightly in his slippers, dressing gown, and nightcap, and that he had a cold. The grass was not to be resisted. They passed through the wall and stood upon an open country road. "Good heavens," sighed Scrooge. "I was a boy here." He was conscious of 1,000 odors floating in the air, each one connected with 1,000 thoughts and hopes long, long forgotten. "You recollect the way?" inquired the spirit. "Remember it? I could walk it blindfolded." They walked along the road until a little market town appeared in the distance. Some shaggy ponies were now seen trotting toward them with boys on their backs and great spirits shouting to each other. Scrooge knew and named every one of them. Why was he rejoiced beyond all bounds to see them? Why did his cold eye glisten and his heart leap up as they went past? Why was he filled with gladness when he heard them give each other Merry Christmas? They left the high road and soon approached a large house, but one of broken fortunes. The walls were damp and mossy, the windows broken, the gates decayed. Entering the dreary hall and glancing through the doors, Scrooge could see a lonely boy reading near a feeble fire. He sat down and wept to see his poor forgotten self as he used to be. "I wish, but it's too late now," Scrooge muttered after drying his eyes with his cuff. "What is the matter?" asked the spirit. "Nothing, nothing. There was a boy singing a Christmas carol at my door last night, and I should like to have given him something, that's all." The ghost smiled and waved his hand, saying, "Let us see another Christmas." They were now in the busy city at Christmas time. The ghost stopped at a warehouse door and asked Scrooge if he knew it. "Know it? I was apprenticed here." They went in. At the sight of an old gentleman in a Welsh wig, Scrooge cried in great excitement, "Why, it's old Fezziwig! Bless his heart, it's Fezziwig alive again!" Old Fezziwig laid down his pen and looked up at the clock, which pointed to the hour of 7. He rubbed his hands, adjusted his waistcoat, laughed, and called out in rich, jovial voice, "Yo-ho there! Ebenezer? Dick?" Scrooge's former self, a young man, came briskly in, accompanied by his fellow apprentice. "Dick Wilkins, to be sure," said Scrooge to the ghost. "My old fellow apprentice, bless me, yes, there he is. He was very much attached to me. Poor Dick, poor dear." "Yo-ho, my boys," said Fezziwig. "No more work tonight. Christmas Eve, Dick. Ebenezer. Let's have the shutters up before a man can say Jack Robinson. Clear away, my lads. Let's have lots of room here." Every movable was packed off. The floor was swept and watered. The lamps were trimmed. Fuel was heaped upon the fire, and the warehouse was as bright as a ballroom. In came a fiddler with a music book and tuned like 50 stomach aches. In came Mrs. Fezziwig, one vast, substantial smile. In came the 3 Miss Fezziwigs, beaming and lovable. In came all the young men and women employed in the business, the housemaid, the baker, the cook, the milkman. Away they all went, 20 couples at once, hands half round and back again the other way, down the middle and up again, round and round. There were more dances, and there was cake, cold roast, mince pies, plenty of beer. But when the fiddler struck up Sir Roger de Coverley, old Fezziwig danced with Mrs. Fezziwig, as did 20 pairs of partners who would dance and had no notion of walking. When the clock struck 7, the ball broke up. Mr. and Mrs. Fezziwig took their stations on either side of the door, and shaking hands with every person individually as he or she went out, wished him or her a Merry Christmas. "A small matter," said the ghost, "to make these silly folks so full of gratitude. He has spent but a few pounds of your mortal money. Is that so much that he deserves this praise? What's the matter?" "Nothing particular." "Something, I think?" No, I should like to be able to see a word or two to my clerk just now. That's all." "My time grows short," observed the spirit. "Quick." Scrooge now saw himself a man in the prime of life. He sat by the side of a fair young girl in a black dress, in whose eyes were tears. "It matters little," she said softly to Scrooge's former self. "To you, very little. Another idol has displaced me, and if it can comfort you in time to come as I would have tried to do, I have no cause to grieve." What idol has displaced you?" "A golden one. I have seen your noble aspirations fall, one by one, until the master passion, gain, engrosses you." "Even if I've grown so much wiser, what then? I'm not changed toward you." She shook her head. "Our contract is an old one, made when we were both poor and content to be so. You are changed. When it was made, you were another man. I was a boy. That which promised happiness when we were one in heart is fraught with misery now. I have thought of this enough that I can release you. Have I ever sought release from our engagement? In words, no, never. In what then? In a changed nature, in an altered spirit, in everything that made my love of any worth or value in your sight. Would you seek me out and try to win me now? No. Or choosing me, do I not know that your regret would surely follow? I do, and I release you with a full heart for the love of him you once were. May you be happy in the life you have chosen. And she left him. Spirit, said Scrooge, show me no more. One shadow more, exclaimed the ghost. No more, cried Scrooge. I don't wish to see it. But the relentless ghost forced him to observe a room full of comfort. Near the winter fire sat a beautiful young girl, so like that last that Scrooge believed it was the same, until he saw her, now a comely matron, sitting opposite her daughter. A knocking at the door was heard in time to greet the father, laden with Christmas toys and presents, the joy, the gratitude, the ecstasy. Scrooge looked on more attentively when the master of the house, having his daughter leaning fondly on him, sat down with her and her mother at the fireside. And when he thought that such another creature, quite as graceful and as full of promise, might have called him father, and might have been a springtime in the haggard winter of his life, his sight grew very dim indeed. Belle, said the husband with a smile, I saw an old friend of yours this afternoon. She added, laughing as he laughed, Mr. Scrooge? Mr. Scrooge it was. I passed his office window, and he had a candle inside. His partner lies upon the point of death, I hear. And there he sat quite alone in the world, I do believe. Spirit, said Scrooge in a broken voice, remove me from this place. I cannot bear it. Take me back. Haunt me no longer. I told you these were the shadows of things that have been, said the ghost. They are what they are. Do not blame me. As he struggled with the spirit, he was overcome by drowsiness in his own bedroom. He had barely time to reel to bed before he sank into a heavy sleep. Waking, Scrooge found that his bedroom and adjoining sitting room were now hung with green leaves of holly, mistletoe, and ivy. A mighty blaze roaring up the chimney. Heaped upon the floor were turkeys, geese, game, mince pies, plum pudding, hot chestnuts, cherry-choked apples, juicy oranges, luscious pears, immense cakes, and great bowls of punch. There sat a jolly giant. Come in and know me better, man. I am the ghost of Christmas present. Spirit, conduct me where you will. Last night I learned a lesson. Tonight, if you have to teach me, let me profit by it. Touch my robe. The room vanished instantly, and they stood in the city street upon a snowy Christmas morning. Scrooge and the ghost passed on to Scrooge's clerk's house. There was Mrs. Cratchit, dressed in ribbons. She laid the tablecloth, assisted by one of her daughters, also in ribbons, while Master Peter Cratchit plunged a fork into the saucepan of potatoes. Two smaller Cratchits, a boy and a girl, came tearing in screaming that they had smelt the goose and known it was from their own. In came Bob and Tiny Tim upon his shoulder. He bore a little crutch, his limbs supported by an iron frame. The two young Cratchits hustled Tiny Tim off to the wash house to hear the pudding singing in the copper. And how did little Tim behave? Asked Mrs. Cratchit after Bob hugged his daughter to his heart's content. As good as gold, said Bob, and better. He gets thoughtful sitting by himself so much. He told me he hoped the people saw him in the church because he was a cripple, and it might be pleasant to them on Christmas Day, who made lame beggars walk and blind men see. Bob's voice was tremulous when he told them this, and trembled more when he said that Tiny Tim was growing strong and hearty. Back came Tiny Tim before another word was spoken. Mrs. Cratchit made the gravy hissing hot, and the two young Cratchits set chairs for everybody. At last, the dishes were set and grace was said. It was succeeded by a breathless pause as Mrs. Cratchit, looking slowly all along the carving knife, prepared to plunge it in the breast. When the long-expected gush of stuffing issued forth, one murmur of delight rose all round. Bob said he didn't believe there was ever such a goose cooked. Its tenderness, flavor, size, and cheapness were the themes of universal admiration. Mrs. Cratchit left the room, nervous to take the pudding up and bring it in. Suppose it should not be done enough. Suppose it should break in turning out. Suppose somebody got over the back of the wall and in the yard and stole it. All sorts of horrors were supposed. Hello, a great deal of steam. The pudding was out of the copper. A smell like washing day. That was the cloth. A smell like an eating house and a pastry cook next door to each other, with a laundress next door to that. That was the pudding. In half a minute, Mrs. Cratchit entered, flushed and smiling proudly with the pudding. Like a speckled cannonball, so hard and firm, blazing of ignited brandy and bedight with Christmas holly stuck in the top. Oh, a wonderful pudding. Bob Cratchit said that he regarded it as the greatest success achieved by Mrs. Cratchit since their marriage. Everybody had something to say about it. At last the dinner was all done. The cloth was cleared, the hearth swept, and the fire made up. Apples and oranges were put upon the table, and a shovelful of chestnuts on the fire. Then all the Cratchit family drew round the hearth, and at Bob Cratchit's elbow stood the family display of glass. 2 tumblers and a custard cup without a handle. These held the hot stuff from the jug, however, as well as golden goblets would have done, and Bob served it out with beaming looks, while the chestnuts on the fire sputtered and crackled noisily. Then Bob proposed, "A Merry Christmas to all of us, my dears. God bless us." "God bless us, every one," said Tiny Tim. He sat very close to his father's side, upon his little stool. Bob held his withered little hand in his. He loved the child and wished to keep him by his side, and dreaded that he might be taken from him. "Spare it," said Scrooge with an interest he'd never felt before. "Tell me if Tiny Tim will live." "I see a vacant seat," replied the ghost, "in a poor chimney corner, and a crutch without an owner." "No, no, kind spirit, say you will be spared." "If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, none will find him here. If he be like to die, he had better do it and decrease the surplus population." Scrooge hung his head to hear his own words quoted, and was overcome with penitence and grief. Scrooge raised his head on hearing his name. "Mr. Scrooge," said Bob. "I'll give you Mr. Scrooge, the founder of the feast." "The founder of the feast, indeed," cried Mrs. Cratchit, reddening. "I wish I had him here. I'd give him a piece of my mind to feast upon, and I hope he'd have a good appetite for it." "My dear," said Bob, "the children, Christmas Day." "It should be Christmas Day, I'm sure," said she, "on which one drinks to the health of such an odious, stingy, hard, unfeeling man as Mr. Scrooge. You know he is, Robert. Nobody knows it better than you do, poor fellow." "My dear," was Bob's mild answer, Christmas Day. I'll drink to his health for your sake and the day's, said Mrs. Cratchit, not for his. Scrooge was the ogre of the family. The mention of his name cast a dark shadow on the party, which was not dispelled for a full 5 minutes. After it had passed, they were 10 times merrier than before from the mere relief of Scrooge the Baleful being done with. All this time the chestnuts and the jug went round, and by they had a song from Tiny Tim, who sang it very well indeed. They were not a handsome family. They were not well dressed. Their clothes were scanty, but they were happy, grateful, pleased with one another, and contented. And when they faded, Scrooge had his eye on Tiny Tim until the last. It was a great surprise to Scrooge as this scene vanished to hear a hearty laugh. It was his nephew's in a gleaming room. There's nothing in the world so irresistible contagious as laughter and good humor. "He said that Christmas was a humbug as I live," cried Scrooge's nephew. "He believed it too." "More shame for him, Fred," said Scrooge's niece indignantly. She was very pretty, exceedingly pretty, with a dimpled, surprised-looking face, a ripe little mouth that seemed made to be kissed, as no doubt it was, and the sunniest pair of eyes you ever saw. Altogether, she was what you would have called provoking, but satisfactory, too. Oh, perfectly satisfactory. "He's a comical old fellow," said Scrooge's nephew. "That's the truth, and not so pleasant as he might be. However, his offenses carry their own punishment, and I have nothing to say against him. Who suffers by his ill whims himself, always. Here he takes it into his head to dislike us, and he won't come and dine with us. What's the consequence? What do you say, Topper?" Topper clearly had his eye on one of Scrooge's nieces, for he answered that a bachelor was a wretched outcast who had no right to express an opinion on the subject. Scrooge's niece, the plump one with the lace tucker, not the one with the roses, blushed. After tea, there was a game called Blind Man's Bluff, and I no more believe Topper was really blinded than I believe he had eyes in his boots. The way he went after that plump sister in the lace tucker was an outrage, knocking down the fire irons, tumbling over the chairs. Wherever she went, he went. Next was a game called Yes and No, where Scrooge's nephew had to think of something and the rest might find out what. He only answering the questions yes or no. He was thinking of an animal, rather a disagreeable animal, an animal that growled sometimes and talked sometimes, and lived in London and walked about the streets and was not a horse or a cow or a dog or a pig or a cat or a bear. At last the plump sister cried out, "I know what it is, Fred, I know what it is. It's your Uncle Scrooge," which it certainly was, though some objected that the reply to "Is it a bear?" ought to have been yes. But the whole scene passed, and Scrooge and the spirit were again on their travels. Much they saw, far they went. Suddenly, in an open place, the bell struck 12. Scrooge looked for the ghost and saw it no more. At the last stroke, he lifted his eyes and beheld a solid phantom, draped and hooded, coming like a mist along the ground toward him. The phantom slowly, gravely, silently approached. Scrooge bent down upon his knee, for the air through which the spirit moved seemed to scatter gloom, mystery. It was shrouded in a deep black garment which concealed his head, its face, its form, and left nothing of it visible save one outstretched hand. Am I in the presence of the ghost of Christmas yet to come? Ghost of the future, I fear you more than any specter I have seen. But as I know your purpose is to do me good, and as I hope to live to be another man from which I was, I am prepared for your company with a thankful heart. Lead on, Spirit. The city seemed to spring up about them. The Spirit stopped beside one little knot of businessmen. The hand was pointed to them, so Scrooge advanced to listen to their talk. "No," said a great fat man with a monstrous chin. "I don't know much about it either way, only know he's dead." "When did he die?" inquired another. "Last night, I believe." "Why, what was the matter with him? I thought he'd never die." "And God knows," said the first with a yawn. "Well, what has he done with his money?" asked a red-faced gentleman. "I haven't heard," said the man with the large chin. "Company, perhaps. He hasn't left it to me, that's all I know." Scrooge was surprised that the Spirit should attach importance to a conversation so trivial. It could scarcely have had any bearing on the death of an old partner, for that was past, and this ghost province was the future. He looked about for his own image, but he saw no likeness of himself among the multitude. They left this busy scene and went into an obscure part of the town to a low shop where iron, old rags, bottles, and bones were bought. A gray-haired rascal sat smoking his pipe as a woman with a heavy bundle slunk into his shop. "What have you got to sell?" "Half a minute's patience, Joe, and you shall see. Who's the worse for the loss of a few things like these? Not a dead man, I suppose. If he wanted to keep him after he was dead, the wicked old screw, why wasn't he natural in his lifetime? If he had been, he'd have had somebody look after him when he was struck with death, instead of lying gasping there alone by himself. Open that bundle, old Joe, and let me know the value of it." Joe opened the bundle and dragged out a large, heavy roll. "Bed curtains?" "Bed curtains. Don't drop that oil on the blankets now." "His blankets? Who else's do you think? He isn't likely to take cold with him, I dare say." "You may look through that shirt till your eyes ache, but you won't find a hole in it. No, the threadbare place. It's the best he had. And a fine one, too. They'd have wasted it by dressing it in him if it hadn't been for me." Scrooge listened to this dialogue in horror. "Spirit, the case of this unhappy man might be my own. My life tends to be that way now." "Merciful heavens, what is this?" The scene had changed, and he almost touched a bare, uncurtained bed. On it, unwatched, uncared for, was the body of this plundered unknown man. The phantom's steady hand was pointed to the head. The cover was adjusted so that the slightest motion on Scrooge's part would have disclosed the face. He thought of it, felt how easy it would be to do, and longed to do it, to remove the veil. "I understand you," Scrooge returned, "and I would do it if I could, but I have not the power. Spirit, if there is any person in the town who feels emotion caused by this man's death, show that person to me, I beseech you." The phantom spread its dark road before him, and before withdrawing it, revealed a room with a mother and her children. She was anxiously expecting someone. At length, a knock was heard, and she hurried to the door to meet her husband, whose face was careworn and depressed. "Is it good or bad?" he said. "Bad," he answered. "We are quite ruined." "No, there is hope, Caroline." "If he relents," she said, "there is." "He is past relenting," said her husband. "He's dead." She was thankful in her soul to hear it, and she said so with clasped hands. She was sorry, but the first emotion was that of her heart. Her husband continued, "It was bad fortune indeed to find so merciless a creditor. We may sleep tonight with light hearts, Caroline." "Spirit, let me see some tenderness connected with death," said Scrooge. "All this dark chamber will be forever present to me." The ghost returned him to Bob Cratchit's house and found the mother and the children seated around the fire. Quiet. Very quiet. The little Cratchits were as still as statues and stood looking up at Peter, who had a book before him. And he took a child and set him to the midst of them. The mother laid her work on the table and put her hand up to her face. "The color hurts my eyes," she said. "It makes them weak by candlelight, and I wouldn't show weak eyes to your father when he comes home. For the world, it must be near his time." "Past it, rather," Peter answered. "But I think he has walked a little slower these last few evenings, Mother. I've known him to walk with Tiny Tim upon his shoulder very fast indeed. But he was very light to carry, and his father loved him so that it was no trouble. Oh, there's your father at the door." She hurried out to meet him. His tea was ready for him, and the two young Cratchits got upon his knees and laid, each child, a little cheek against his face as if to say, "Don't be grieved." Bob was very cheerful with them. He looked at the work upon the table and praised Mrs. Cratchit and the girls. They would be done long before Sunday, he said. "Sunday? You went today then, Robert?" "Yes, my dear," returned Bob. "I wish you could have gone. It would have done you so good to see how green a place it is. But you'll see it often." "My little child." He broke down all at once. He couldn't help it. "Spectre," said Scrooge, "tell me who that man was with the covered face whom we saw lying dead." The ghost conveyed him to a dismal, wretched churchyard. The spirit stood among the graves and pointed down to one. "Before I draw nearer to that stone to which you point, answer me one question. Are these the shadows of things that will be, or are they the shadows of things that may be only? Men's courses lead to certain ends, but if the courses be departed from, the ends will change. Say it is thus with what you show me." The spirit was as immovable as ever. Scrooge crept toward the stone, trembling as he went, following the finger read on the neglected grave, "Ebenezer Scrooge. Am I that man who lay upon the bed? No, spirit, oh no, hear me. I am not the man I was. Why show me this if I am past all hope? Assure me that I may yet change these shadows you have shown me. I'll try to keep it all the year. I will not shut out the lessons that I have been taught. Oh, tell me, I may sponge away the writing on this stone." Holding up his hands in one last prayer to have his face reversed, he saw the phantom's hood and dress as it shrunken, shriveled down into his own bedpost in his own room. Best and happiest of all, the time before him was his own, to make amends in. He heard the church bells ringing out the lustiest peals he had ever heard. Running to the window, he opened it and put out his head to see a clear, bright, stirring, golden day. "What's today?" cried Scrooge, calling downward to a boy in Sunday's clothes. "Today? Why, it's Christmas Day." "It's Christmas Day. I haven't missed it. Hello, my fine fellow. Hello. Do you know the butcher's shop on the next street at the corner?" "I should hope." An intelligent boy, remarkable boy. Do you know whether they've sold the prize turkey that was hanging up there? Not the little prize turkey, the big one. What? The one big as me? What a delightful boy. It's a pleasure to talk to him. Yes, me buck. It's hanging there now. Is it? Go and buy it. What? Exclaimed the boy. Go and buy it and tell him to bring it here that I may give them the direction where to take it. Come back with the man and I'll give you a shilling. Come back with him in less than 5 minutes. I'll give you half a crown. The boy was off like a shot. I'll send it to Bob Cratchit's. He shan't know who sends it. It's twice the size of Tiny Tim. It was a turkey. He never could have stood upon his legs, that bird. He would have snapped them off like sticks of sealing wax. Scrooge dressed himself in his best and got out into the streets. The people were pouring forth, and Scrooge regarded everyone with a delightful smile. He looked so irresistibly pleasant that 3 or 4 good-humored fellows said, "Good morning, sir. Merry Christmas to you." And Scrooge said often afterwards that of all the blithe sounds he had ever heard, those were the blithest in his ears. He had not gone far when, coming toward him, was the gentleman who had walked into his counting house the day before and said, "Scrooge and Molly's, I believe." "My dear sir," said Scrooge, taking the old gentleman by both his hands. How do you do? I hope you succeeded yesterday. It was a very, very kind of you. A Merry Christmas to you, sir." "Mr. Scrooge?" "Yes, that's my name, and I fear it might not be pleasant to you. Allow me to ask your pardon. Will you have the goodness..." Here Scrooge whispered into his ear. "Lord bless me," cried the gentleman. "My dear Mr. Scrooge, are you serious?" "If you please," said Scrooge, "not a farthing less. A great many back payments are included in it, I assure you. Will you do me that favor?" "My dear sir," said the other, shaking hands with him, "I don't know what to say to such munificent..." "Don't say anything, please," retorted Scrooge. "Come and see me, will you?" "I will," cried the gentleman. Scrooge walked the streets, went to church, patted children on the head, looked down into kitchens of houses and up to the windows, and found that everything could yield him pleasure. He had never dreamed that any walk, that anything, could give him so much happiness. In the afternoon, he turned toward his nephew's house. He passed that door a dozen times before he had the courage to go up and knock. But he made a dash and did it. "Is your master at home, my dear?" said Scrooge to the girl at the door. "Yes, sir. He's in the dining room, sir, with his mistress." "He knows me," said Scrooge. "Fred, it is I, your Uncle Scrooge. I've come to dinner. Will you let me in, Fred?" Let him in. It's a mercy he didn't shake his arm off. He was at home in 5 minutes. Wonderful party, wonderful games, wonderful happiness. But he was early at the office next morning. Oh, he was very early there. If he could only catch Bob Cratchit coming late. That was the thing he had set his heart upon, and he did it. The clock struck 9. No Bob. A quarter past. No Bob. Bob was a full 18.5 minutes behind. Scrooge sat with his door wide open that he might see him come in. Bob's hat was off before he opened the door. He was on his stool in a jiffy, driving away with his pen as if he were trying to overtake 9 o'clock. "Hello," growled Scrooge in his accustomed voice as he nearly could feign it. "What do you mean by coming in here at this time of day?" "I'm very sorry, sir. I am behind my time." "You are? Yes, I think you are. Step this way, if you please." It's only once a year, sir. It shall not be repeated. I was making rather merry yesterday, sir. Now I'll tell you what, my friend, I'm not going to stand for this sort of thing any longer. And therefore, Scrooge continued, leaping from his stool, I'm about to raise your salary. Bob trembled. A Merry Christmas, Bob, said Scrooge as he clapped him on the back. A merrier Christmas, Bob, my good fellow, than I've given you for many a year. I'll raise your salary and assist your struggling family. And we will discuss your affairs this very afternoon after a bowl of punch, Bob. Make up the fire and buy a second coal scuttle before you dot another I, Bob Cratchit. Scrooge was better than his word. He did it all and infinitely more. And to Tiny Tim, who did not die, he was a second father. He became as good a friend, as good a master, and as good a man as the old city knew. He had no further discourse with spirits, and it was always said of him that he knew how to keep Christmas well. May that be truly said of all of us. And so as Tiny Tim observed, God bless us, everyone. Thank you. Thank you. Very kind, thank you.